Hi everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. For most Americans, a trade war with Canada probably doesn't sound like the kind of thing that should keep you up at night. Canada isn't China. It isn't Russia. It isn't a military adversary. It's our neighbor. It's our ally. And for generations, Americans have crossed the border, traded with Canadians, bought Canadian products, sold American products, and built companies around one simple assumption. The US-Canada border is a bridge, not a wall. But that assumption is now being tested. And what happened this week may be much more important than another headline about tariffs. President Donald Trump has threatened to raise tariffs on Canadian cars, trucks, auto parts, and steel to 50%, starting the 1st of January 2027. That's a huge escalation. The threat came after US-Canada trade negotiations broke down, and Canada has already prepared retaliatory measures against American goods. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has described the situation as an economic attack, while Trump has continued to argue that Canada has been taking advantage of the United States. But here's the question I want to ask today. Is Trump using America's economic power to get a better deal from Canada? Or is he beginning to destroy one of America's greatest economic advantages? Because this isn't just a fight over tariffs anymore. It's becoming a fight over the future of the North American economy. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the automobile industry. Think about a vehicle built in North America. You might imagine an American car being built in an American factory with American parts and then sold to an American consumer. But that's not how the modern North American auto industry works. Imagine a component being produced in Michigan. It crosses the border into Ontario. Another stage of manufacturing takes place there. The component, or another related part, then moves back into the United States for another stage of assembly. Meanwhile, other parts are moving in the opposite direction. Engines, transmissions, electronics, steel, aluminum, and countless other components move through the same continental network. And eventually, all of those pieces come together in a finished vehicle. So by the time that vehicle arrives at an American dealership, what exactly is it? An American car? A Canadian car? The honest answer is, it's a North American car. That's the part of this trade war that is easy to miss. The American and Canadian auto industries aren't two separate machines sitting on opposite sides of a border. They're one highly integrated production system. Canada currently accounts for roughly 13% of U.S. vehicle and auto parts imports, and analysts are warning that a 50% tariff could force major changes throughout the North American supply chain. So when Washington says, we'll put a 50% tariff on Canadian auto parts, it sounds like the United States is simply punishing Canada. But the economic reality is more complicated. Because an American factory may need those Canadian parts. And if the parts suddenly become much more expensive, the American factory has three choices. It can absorb the cost. It can pressure its suppliers to absorb the cost. Or it can pass the cost on to the customer. And eventually, that customer is an American. This is why I think the most important question isn't, will Canada suffer from Trump's tariffs? Of course, Canada will suffer. The more interesting question is, how much of that pain eventually comes back to the United States? Because tariffs don't magically make foreign costs disappear. They move costs through the supply chain. And sometimes, those costs eventually show up on a price tag. Imagine you're in Michigan and you're shopping for a new pickup truck. You walk into the dealership, you sit down, you negotiate, and then you look at the final price. It's several $1,000s higher than you expected. The salesman explains that the vehicle contains components whose cost has risen because of new tariffs. You probably aren't thinking about U.S. Canada trade negotiations at that moment. You're thinking, why is my truck so expensive? That's the political problem. Trump can talk about reshoring factories. He can talk about bringing manufacturing back to America. He can talk about making American industry stronger. And those are goals that many Americans can understand and support. But the voter doesn't experience trade policy as a tariff schedule. The voter experiences it as a monthly car payment. That's a very different thing. And this is where Trump's strategy becomes a gamble. The theory behind the tariffs is straightforward. If it becomes too expensive to manufacture cars in Canada and sell them in the United States, companies will have an incentive to move production into America. Trump's message is essentially, build here and you pay zero tariff. Build somewhere else and you pay. The White House has explicitly framed the tariff strategy as a way to encourage production in the United States. That could work. Companies do respond to incentives. Factories can move. New plants can be built. Investment can be redirected. But there is a major problem. You cannot rebuild a continental supply chain overnight. It takes years to build a factory, years to qualify suppliers, years to redesign production lines, years to train workers, and billions of dollars to make the transition. In the meantime, companies still have to produce cars. They still need parts. And consumers still need to buy vehicles. That's why the North American auto industry is so nervous. The issue isn't simply whether a Canadian factory survives. The issue is whether the entire production network becomes more expensive and less efficient. And that leads to a much bigger question. Is the United States actually trying to bring manufacturing home? Or is it willing to sacrifice some of North America's existing efficiency in order to force companies to relocate? Those are not the same strategy. And the answer could determine whether this trade war ultimately succeeds. Now let's talk about Canada. Because if the United States has so much leverage, why isn't Canada simply giving in? That's a fair question. Canada depends heavily on the American market. There's no denying that. The overwhelming majority of Canadian exports go to the United States. Canada cannot simply replace America with Europe or Asia next year. The geography doesn't disappear. The supply chains don't disappear. And the American consumer market remains enormously important. Trump knows this. That's why he believes Washington has the upper hand. And in pure economic terms, he probably does. But economic leverage isn't the same thing as unlimited power. Canada has leverage of its own. Energy, electricity, critical minerals, agricultural products, industrial inputs, and, importantly, access to parts of the North American supply chain that American manufacturers depend on. Ontario Premier Doug Ford has already warned that Canada could use electricity exports and critical minerals as leverage if the confrontation continues. And Canada is preparing retaliation against American goods. The goal isn't necessarily to match every tariff perfectly. The goal is to find American products and industries where political pressure will be felt. That's how trade wars work. You don't just attack the other country's economy. You attack the other country's political coalition. But there's an important update since I recorded this video. Canada is no longer simply threatening retaliation. Ottawa has now announced new tariffs on roughly 700 American products, worth about $20 billion, with some tariffs reaching 50%. The measures are scheduled to take effect on September 8th. And what's particularly interesting is that Canada isn't just trying to hurt the American economy. Some of these measures are clearly designed to create political pressure inside the United States. In other words, Canada may have realized something important about Trump's strategy. You don't necessarily have to beat the United States economically. You just have to make the trade war politically painful in the right places. And that brings us back to the 2026 midterm elections. A higher price for a truck, a more expensive piece of equipment, a smaller agricultural export order, these aren't abstract trade statistics anymore. They're things voters can actually see and feel. And that's when a trade war becomes a political problem for the president who started it. This is where I think the story gets much more interesting. Because Trump doesn't have an unlimited amount of time to prove that his tariff strategy works. American voters will eventually judge the results. And here's the problem. The tariff itself is invisible. The bill isn't. Imagine an American family that wants to buy a new car. The sticker price goes up. The monthly payment goes up. The family decides to keep its old vehicle for another year. Now imagine another family trying to buy a home. Canadian lumber, plywood, steel, cement, or other building materials become more expensive. The builder's costs go up. And eventually, the buyer gets the bill. That family doesn't experience this as trade policy. They experience it as, why is buying a house even more expensive? And then think about an American farmer. Suppose you grow beef, grain, dairy products, or another agricultural product that has a major Canadian market. Canada retaliates. Your product becomes more expensive for Canadian buyers. Maybe orders fall. Maybe the Canadian customer switches suppliers. Maybe you have to accept a lower price. Maybe you end up with more inventory and less cash. Again, you don't experience this as an international trade dispute. You experience it as a smaller paycheck. This is why trade wars become politically dangerous. The benefits are often described in very large numbers. More factories, more investment, more jobs, stronger manufacturing. But the costs arrive in very personal numbers. $3,000 more for a truck, higher construction costs, lower farm income, higher prices for parts, a bigger monthly payment. That's the difference between macroeconomics and politics. And the 2026 midterms will force Republicans to confront that difference. If Trump can point to factories being built in Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and other manufacturing states, he can make a powerful argument. He can say, "You were told tariffs would bring manufacturing home. Look at the factories. Look at the investment. Look at the jobs." But if voters instead see higher prices and disrupted supply chains, Democrats will have an equally simple argument. You were promised that tariffs would make America stronger. Why is everything costing more? And there is another problem. Canada isn't just America's neighbor. It's an important customer. If Canada retaliates against American agricultural products, the political consequences won't be evenly distributed across the country. They'll be concentrated in specific states, specific congressional districts, specific farming communities. That's where trade policy can become election politics. And we've already seen Republican lawmakers expressing concerns about the confrontation with Canada, including criticism of restrictions affecting beef imports. So the question for Republicans isn't simply whether tariffs are economically defensible. The question is, can the benefits become visible before the political costs become visible? That's a race against time. And there's another important issue here. Trump may be able to force Canadian companies to rethink where they manufacture, but he may also force Canadian businesses and consumers to rethink where they buy. And that could have long-term consequences. For decades, Canada's economic relationship with the United States was built on trust and predictability. Canadian companies knew the American market was next door. American companies knew Canadian suppliers were reliable. Both sides knew that political disagreements could happen, but the underlying economic relationship would remain relatively stable. Now that assumption is being challenged. Canadian businesses are asking, can we really build our future around the American market if Washington can suddenly impose a 50% tariff? Should we diversify our exports? Should we find new suppliers? Should we develop new customers? Should we invest somewhere else? These questions don't disappear, even if Trump eventually reaches a deal with Canada. Once a company spends billions of dollars building an alternative supply chain, it doesn't necessarily dismantle it just because tariffs come down. And that's where I see the greatest strategic risk for the United States. Trump may be trying to make Canada more dependent on America, but excessive pressure could encourage Canada to become less dependent on America. That's the paradox. The United States has enormous economic leverage because Canada is so deeply connected to the American economy. But if Washington uses that leverage too aggressively, Canada has a powerful incentive to build alternatives. Not because those alternatives are cheaper, not because they're easier, but because Canada may decide that dependence itself has become a strategic risk, and that's why Mark Carney's resistance matters. From Washington's perspective, Canada should recognize the imbalance of power and compromise. From Ottawa's perspective, this is becoming about more than tariffs. It's about whether Canada can make its own economic decisions. Recent reporting indicates that Canadian officials rejected U.S. demands they considered too restrictive, including concerns over Canada's ability to pursue independent trade arrangements and policies tied to national identity. That is why this dispute has become so emotionally charged. If Canadians believe they are negotiating over tariffs, they can compromise. If they believe they are negotiating over sovereignty, compromise becomes politically dangerous. And once nationalism enters the equation, economic calculations become much harder. This is also why I don't think Americans should assume that everything will automatically return to normal after Trump leaves office. People often say, just wait until the next president. But businesses don't necessarily think that way. A company planning a factory for the next 20 years can't simply assume that every future administration will maintain the same trade policy. If the rules change dramatically from one administration to another, companies start pricing political risk into their decisions. And political risk has a cost. So even if Trump eventually reaches a new agreement with Canada, something important may already have changed. Canada has learned that access to the American market can be used as a weapon. American companies have learned that Canadian supply chains can become politically vulnerable, and both sides are now thinking about diversification. That is a much bigger story than a 25% tariff becoming 50%, because the real question is not, who wins this month's tariff fight? It's, who will be more economically independent 5 or 10 years from now? And there is an even bigger strategic question for the United States. North America is one of America's greatest potential economic advantages. Think about the geography. The United States has the world's largest consumer market. Canada has enormous natural resources, energy, and critical minerals. Mexico has a huge manufacturing base and a young workforce. And all three countries are connected by roads, railways, pipelines, ports, and established supply chains. Together, North America has the potential to become one of the most competitive economic regions in the world. That is a strategic advantage that China and Europe would love to have. So Washington has to be careful. If tariffs encourage more production in America while preserving North American integration, Trump could eventually claim a major victory. But if tariffs destroy the efficiency of the continental supply chain, drive up prices, discourage investment, and push Canada toward alternative markets, the United States could weaken the very economic system that gives it leverage in the first place. That's the dilemma. And that's why I wouldn't describe this simply as Trump versus Canada. It's really Trump versus the old North American economic model. Trump wants a system in which America uses the size of its market to demand better terms. Canada wants a system in which economic integration does not mean political dependence. Those two ideas are increasingly colliding. And neither side can completely walk away. Canada needs America. America benefits enormously from Canada. That's precisely why this fight is so dangerous. They are too important to each other to simply separate, but they may also be too distrustful of each other to return to the old relationship. And there's another sign that this dispute is becoming something bigger than trade. Trump has now talked about renaming Lake Ontario Lake America, while Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney says some of Washington's demands go far beyond normal trade negotiations and touch Canada's national interests and sovereignty. That's important because once a trade dispute becomes a dispute about national identity, language, and sovereignty, compromise becomes much harder. So the question isn't simply who will win the next tariff battle. The question is whether Washington and Ottawa can still negotiate like allies. So where does this actually go from here? I don't think the answer is necessarily a permanent trade war. Trump has used tariff threats as negotiating weapons before. The latest escalation could still be designed to force Canada back to the negotiating table. And there are already signs that both sides understand the enormous costs of allowing the conflict to spiral indefinitely. But even if a deal eventually emerges, the relationship has already changed. The question now is whether that change becomes temporary or permanent. Will Trump succeed in bringing more auto production into the United States? Will American consumers accept higher short-term costs in exchange for greater domestic manufacturing? Will Canada eventually decide that access to America is simply too valuable to resist? Or will Canada use this crisis to diversify its economy and reduce its dependence on the United States? And perhaps the most important question for Americans is much simpler. What does this trade war cost you? Not Washington, not Ottawa. You, your truck, your house, your farm, your factory, your paycheck, because that's where the political consequences will ultimately appear. The tariff is invisible. The bill isn't. And that may be the most important thing for Donald Trump to remember as the 2026 midterm elections approach. He can win the argument in Washington. He can win the negotiating battle with Canada. He can even force companies to move factories into the United States. But if ordinary Americans look at their receipts and decide that the price of America first is simply too high, the political victory may become much harder to achieve. And that is why this trade war is about much more than Canada. It is a test of whether America can use its enormous economic power without undermining the economic system that made that power possible in the first place. Because sometimes the biggest danger isn't losing a trade war. It's winning the battle and weakening your own position for the next one. Thanks for watching.